Welcome once again, everybody, to the famous Patterson Building in downtown Bismarck. The historic Peacock Alley American Grill and Bar is our home for the Legislature Today radio show. We're here Monday through Thursday nights. Don't forget, Saturday on the air from 10 a.m. until 12 noon. If you want to keep tabs on what's happening in the Legislature now in its 7th or 8th day, I guess, very early in the session, this is the place to do it. GreatPlainsNews.com is a place you can watch us online. And if you miss a show, all the programs are archived there, and also send us questions about what's happening. Busy program for you tonight. We'll give you a rundown on all of that. Want to invite you to join us if you are in Bismarck, Mandan, to the Peacock Alley American Grill and Bar, where it is Wine Down Wednesday. Half-price bottles of wine at the famous Peacock Alley American Grill and Bar. So come on down if you are here. Tonight's program is brought to you by the University of Mary, America's leadership university, and we'll have guests tonight as well from the University of Mary. Today is known as Law Enforcement Day in the Legislature, and Dale Wetzel, managing editor for Great Plains News, is here to give us a recap on the day's events in the Legislature. Why do they call it Law Enforcement Day, Dale?
They call it Law Enforcement Day because there's a lot of policemen there, a lot of sheriffs, a lot of prosecutors, a lot of police officers. It's essentially it's a day for the law enforcement community to come to the Capitol and essentially make its opinions known of a variety of proposals and maybe have some proposals of their own.
I was struck by the fact that at the west entrance of the Capitol, right off the parking lot where the legislators enter the building and park, there was a sobering sight. The Subaru Forester, a small SUV vehicle that was the vehicle that was carrying the Deutscher family.
Yeah, there's nothing like walking past a coffin on your way to work, and that's essentially what it was. On a trailer is a completely crushed small SUV, which was carrying the Deutscher family last July when they were driving from West Fargo to Bismarck. They were westbound, and they collided head-on with a drunken driver who was driving east in the same lane. He was in the wrong lane of the interstate highway. It was a head-on collision. And the car, I mean, I took several pictures of it. There are pictures on the Great Plains Examiner website. And the front of it is just obliterated. And you look at the car and you think, my goodness, this is a coffin. I mean, it's like looking at the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor. And it's just I watched a lot of people walk by and look at the car and watch their reactions, and people were stunned once they realized what it was and what it was doing there. And there's no other way to describe it. I've never seen anything like that at the Capitol during the legislative session since I've been over there, and I've been over there for almost 30 years. I mean, you literally had a crime scene sitting less than 10 feet away from where people walk in the door to go to work.
I, because of your good reporting, knew that that it was there, and took a walk out there, and had the fortune of meeting the father of Allison Deutscher, who literally was at the vehicle at the same time, and I was making small talk with him as a fellow citizen to say, man, this is something. And he said, well, my daughter was killed in this car.
I don't see how he could look at it.
He saw it for the first time Friday, he told me, and the reason he did, he knew it was going to be here for this day, that he planned to be here to interact with legislators, and he said he wanted to see it ahead of time to make sure that he had that behind him. He said that the parents of Allison's husband, Aaron, have not yet been able to even look at the vehicle, and I can understand why. What about took my breath away, I think what any parent is seeing a car seat back there. I mean, you look at that car seat and think of the trauma of that 18-month-old little girl. And
I could barely look at it, to be honest with you, and I don't know the Deutschers at all.
Yeah, so anything other, obviously that dominated the discussion in the hallways today, and we started talking about the legislation. Any other things
we should mention another tragedy that happened, or I should say atrocity, that happened less than 2 days after that. There were a couple of youngsters sleeping in a tent in a campground near Lake Metagoshi, and they were run over. Their tent was run over by a pickup. It was driven by a gentleman who the authorities say he was drinking. He's charged with manslaughter and reckless endangerment. He goes on trial in April, as according to the schedule. And his parents, the young men's parents, this was a 9-year-old boy and a 5-year-old boy, and their parents were in the Capitol today talking to folks about the DUI laws, and their names are Juan Reese and Sandy Hernandez. And they talked at some length about what had happened to their family, what they would like to see happen in terms of changes to laws. And it was just kind of amazing, the poise that these people had. I couldn't hardly believe it. I mean, Mr. Ruiz was standing there and talking in a very even voice. You know, you could tell that he was dying inside, but he was able to relate his experience with, I thought, amazing clarity and emotion. And the only time that they got they started to cry was when I asked them, what were your sons like? And of course they wanted to talk about what their sons like to do, and they like to fish. They were the day before they died, they went and were being towed by a boat on a inner tube, and they were riding a jet ski. They were swimming in the lake, and this was cool stuff for them. And that morning, the morning after the following morning, which was interrupted, of course, by the atrocity, they were going to go fishing, and it was too much.
We're going to be hearing from the parents later in the program, so I encourage you to stay tuned. Both of those incidents are one of the reasons our guest here is with us tonight to talk about enhancing the DUI laws. Why don't you go ahead and introduce our guests, and we'll get rolling with another hour of the legislature today.
Kim Koppelman is a state legislator from West Fargo. He's a member of the U.S. House. He tried. A member of the North Dakota House. Excuse me. I'm sorry about that.
That's all right.
He's a member of the North Dakota House. He is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. He is a former president of the Council of State Governments. Was it president or chairman?
Chairman, actually.
Excuse me. Former chairman of the Council of State Governments, which is a multi-state organization that represents legislatures, the judiciary, and the executive branch. It's a kind of a multidisciplinary group. And he is the primary sponsor of a bill in the legislature that I suppose its most notable feature, what people talk about the most, is that it has a mandatory jail sentence for first offense drunken drivers. You have to be in the Huskow for at least 4 days if you are arrested and convicted of driving under the influence. And Representative Koppelman, why do you think that that's the correct approach?
Well, Dale and Scott, first of all, it's good to be with you. And I don't think there's any magic to a particular formula or a particular solution. But I think this is a good start. And when we looked at this idea of increasing and enhancing the drunk driving laws in North Dakota, we looked at a lot of different ideas. In fact, I began by visiting with law enforcement people from around the state, and particularly in the region where I live and represent in eastern North Dakota, but also around the state with the Attorney General's office, ultimately with state's attorneys around the state, the prosecutors who prosecute these crimes, and eventually with the Governor's office. Both the Attorney General's office and the Governor's office offered great technical assistance, and that was very helpful. So you asked the question of why do I think this is the right approach. I think it's very important to send a message to folks who are first offenders. And the problem that I see, and is the more people that I talk to, whether it's law enforcement folks or lay people about this, they say, you know, we've got a problem with our culture in North Dakota when it comes to drunk driving. Because typically the response to a DUI is either a wink and a nod or a sigh of relief saying, gee, I'm glad it wasn't me that got caught. And yet when the kind of tragedies, atrocities that occur, like the ones you were describing, Dale, then we're all horrified. We're outraged. And those dots just don't connect. We have to figure out a way to say, okay, how do we deal with a first offender in a way that, I mean, we don't want to lock them up forever, of course, but we want to say this is a serious thing, and you have a choice to make. You're at a crossroads here. You know, it's embarrassing, it's inconvenient, it's costing you some money, and in our case, it would put you in the inside of a jail cell for a few days. We think that would help send the message to really force people to look at that situation and say, is this the road I want to go down? Do I want to continue doing this? Do I maybe someday want to run the risk of being the one that is the cause of one of these kinds of atrocities? Or do I want to change the way I deal with drinking and driving?
How does the court system typically deal with a first offense right now?
Well, I'm told by law enforcement folks, prosecutors, and so on, I can't use an absolute term like never, but it's virtually never that anyone goes to jail. In fact, one of the county sheriffs said, you know, the problem is not so much that our penalties are too low, it's just that we never enforce them. Right now, under the law, a first offense DUI is a Class B misdemeanor. Our bill doesn't change that. And that can be up to a 30-day jail sentence, but it virtually never happens. There's always a suspended sentence. People are kind of given a get-out-of-jail-free card, so to speak, and they keep their nose clean for 30 days, and then they're off the hook. And so we didn't even ramp up that actual offense. All we did was change the way the penalty is applied and said, you know what, you ought to be in jail for at least 4 days. And instead of paying a $250 fine, it ought to be a $750 fine, just to try to get their attention.
Why do you think it is that the current law, the full penalties are not applied?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think part of it is, again, our culture, and that is really what we're setting out to change, and I'd like to chat about that a little bit. The other part, I'm sure, is the habits and the practices of the prosecutors, the judges. Some are saying, gee, already in response to this bill, I'm hearing, gee, our jails are full and so on. And so we'll look at ways to maybe tweak the legislation to deal with that when those circumstances arise. So I think there are a lot of reasons.
Do you think that house arrest is appropriate to satisfy a 4-day minimum
It
term?
may be an option. That's one of the things being discussed. I think, though, rather than having an either-or approach, either you can go to jail or do house arrest, because I hear pushback on that, too, for various reasons, and we'll hear more about that, I'm sure, when the bill is heard in our committee. But I would prefer, if we do offer some other option for this because of areas where jails are overcrowded, that we make that a requirement as the trigger. In other words, saying the jail sentence, whatever it is, if it stays at 4 days or that number changes somewhere or whatever, that in a circumstance where there simply isn't jail space available, then you could do whatever choice B is. I mean, so those are the kinds of things, as you know, Dale, from watching the legislative process that get worked out in the committee work and so on.
I was thinking, though, that house arrest might not deliver the sort of shock that one might want.
I think you're right, and frankly, that's one of the concerns I have about that option. But we have to deal with reality, and, you talk to folks in places like Williams County, and they say, we just don't have the space. You want to build us a new jail, fine, but, we don't have the space now. So we will talk about those issues, but what I'm hearing from law enforcement across the board is, don't misunderstand. We're not saying we don't like this bill. We want this change to happen. We just have to figure out how to work out the practicalities.
What are you hearing from prosecutors? Because I imagine that if someone is looking at a 4-day minimum jail stay,
yeah,
they might be less inclined to plead guilty.
Well, that's a good point. And the prosecutors that I've spoken to, I will readily admit that I haven't spoken to certainly every prosecutor in the state, but we're having discussions with them, and I think most of them see the concern, see the need. I mean, it varies. There's one prosecutor in a particular county in the state who was in the news a few months ago saying that I never charge a DUI on the first offense. I always charge reckless driving. That's an issue. Now, I've been reminded by those in the legal profession that the judge also has to approve that plea bargain, so that's really takes into account the entire judicial system, what a prosecutor wants to charge, and if it's a plea bargain, what a judge will accept.
The prosecutor you mentioned, do you think that more people might follow that lead if there's a 4-day minimum?
I don't. I would hope that this kind of a minimum would not lead to that. I would hope that the facts of the case, if they look at the arrest record and see the evidence and say this guy or woman was clearly drunk and it was a danger to themselves and to others, this is clearly a DUI offense, that it wouldn't get pled down, or that a judge would not accept that proposal if it came before them.
One thing I've heard as well as an option is if you are, maybe you should get a mandatory jail term if you're, say, above 0.12 or 0.15 or that's a level above the minimum.
Yep. Incidentally, that's a question we just received from an audience member to want to know if there would be any kind of a difference in, is it automatic no matter what? If you're 0.08, you're 4 days, or whether there would be have a trigger at some point of a blood alcohol content. So,
well, that's a very good question, Scott and Dale. And actually, the way the bill is written right now, it's simply a DUI. However, I think that's a very interesting suggestion that we should be debating, because, and I visited a little bit with the law enforcement folks about that. That might be part of the solution, is to say, here's the standard. If you're, if you've had 2 glasses of wine and you're at 0.08, and the general judgment is, you're not habitual, you're not a danger as much. But if you're at 1.8 versus 0.08, obviously there's an issue. So, yeah, we'll discuss those options. We don't know yet how it'll turn out, but that's part of the process.
One other question from the listeners here. Ellen wanted to know if Democrats are supporting this bill. We should mention that we did invite actually some Democratic co-sponsors of the legislation with Representative Koppelman. There was a Democratic caucus meeting tonight at the same time, so most were agreeable to joining us, just not able to be here. But to Ellen's question, is it a bipartisan bill?
It certainly is. We have, I believe, one member of the Democratic Party as a co-sponsor in the House, and I believe there are 2 from the Senate who are co-sponsors. So, absolutely, and I think that's important. A lot of the issues we deal with in the legislature, as Dale well knows from following us so closely for so long, are not partisan, and I don't think this issue should be. And frankly, I think I welcome the support of the folks in the other party, and this is a North Dakota issue, not a Democrat or Republican.
Well, by the way, one of the things I should mention is that I did get an email from Ed Gruchella, who is a Democrat and a co-sponsor of your bill. I believe
he's not.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, that's all right. That's all right.
I beg your pardon. No. Well, anyway, he said, I'm sure Kim will do a good job. I can't come because of our party caucus, and I'm sure Kim will do a good job. So that's I guess that's an indicator of the nonpartisan nature of this.
Exactly. And Representative Gruchella was actually at the press conference we held on this bill in West Fargo in December, and I didn't get a chance to talk with him there, but I heard from media reports later that he said he thought the bill would pass, and so we certainly would welcome his support. But happy to name the Democrats in the House. We have Representative Lois Delmore, who is from Grand Forks. The senators on the bill, I believe, are Senator David O'Connell, who is, I believe, the senator in the district where the Ruiz tragedy occurred, and also Senator Jim Dotzenrod, who is from Wyndmere, just south of where Lynn Mickelson lives.
Is there not a competing bill, though, by Ed Gruchella?
My understanding, and I have not looked at the bill. I
don't think it's been introduced
yet.
Well,
someone else had it in their hand today. Now, I don't know if it was introduced or not.
I haven't seen it.
But the names on the bill were Senator Tim Mathern and Representative Ed Gruchella, and that was it. And as Dale knows, and you probably know as well, Scott, traditionally in the North Dakota legislature, we've been allowed 6 sponsors on a bill, and now we've upped that to 12, so we have a full complement, I think, on our bill, and we're very pleased with that. If I could return to one thing we mentioned earlier, Dale, we talked about the culture. And, it's interesting. I mentioned from the beginning, when the media asked me about this, is that our problem is we have a culture of drinking and driving in North Dakota that we need to resolve. I don't believe any bill, regardless how tough, regardless how lenient, alone, any law change will solve this problem. It's about you and I. It's about the people listening tonight. And I believe, for example, with the Deutsche tragedy, I looked at the facts of that case, and it seems to me that no law, no matter how tough, would have probably prevented that. But what may have would have been someone in that bar saying, you know what, maybe a bartender saying, I'm not going to serve you anymore, you've had enough. Maybe somebody in the bar taking the keys, saying, you're not getting behind the wheel. I will call a friend, I'll call someone else to pick you up. This is in a rural area, so cabs were nowhere to be found, I'm sure. Or at last resort, someone calling the police and saying there's somebody getting behind the wheel that shouldn't be. And I really think those are the solutions. We're not there yet as a culture. So if this kind of discussion and making the penalties tougher so that people think twice begin to help make that change, I think we've been successful.
Do you have any idea yet when the bill will be heard, when there will be a hearing on the bill?
I believe right now it won't be scheduled until February, at least for the next couple of weeks. We have the schedule completed for next week. It's not on that schedule. We've had one request from one of the law enforcement folks who wants to be there to not do it the following week because he has a conflict. So my guess is a minimum of 2 weeks from now.
Could you talk about what are the consequences in your bill for refusing a breath test? Because I understand that happens quite frequently.
Well, it does, and it's very interesting. There's a U.S. Supreme Court debate, I understand, if I'm not mistaken, right now about that issue of whether you can force someone to take a blood test. Some would argue that it violates the constitutional protection against unreasonable search and seizure. South Dakota has dealt with this issue by saying our law enforcement folks can force someone to take a blood test. And we entertained that idea, but we decided in North Dakota maybe it was best not to encourage wrestling matches on the prairie between county sheriffs and drunk drivers. And so we decided a better way to do it was to say, look, you can refuse if you want, but the penalty for refusal is the same as the penalty for taking a blood test and being found to be in violation. So actually taking the test is your only hope. You can take it and hope you're not.
And we talked about there have been a number of options that have been discussed besides a mandatory jail sentence. One of them is I forget the term for
ignition
it.
interlocks.
Ignition interlocks.
Yes.
So in other words, you have to basically take a breath test before you can start your car.
Right.
What about that option as well?
Well, it's a good idea. It's been around for a while, and I think that's why some are familiar with it and supportive of it. South Dakota tried it somewhat. We've tried it somewhat. Good idea, but the problem is ignition interlocks keep the car from driving drunk. We have a better idea that we think will keep the driver from driving drunk, and that's what's called the 24/7 program, and that also our friends in South Dakota have been using. And basically, it's part of our bill as well that on any offense you would be a mandatory 24/7 participant for a period of time, which varies, of course, depending on the level of offense or the number of times you've repeated the offense. And basically, you come in twice a day for a breath test during that sentence, and you have to breathe clean. You can't be drinking.
We're speaking to Representative Kim Koppelman, Republican from West Fargo. He is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And before we go, I want to ask you about your son is in the legislature too. He was just elected, and how's it like to serve with your son?
Well, that could be a whole program, Dale. It's a great privilege. It's an honor. It's something I never thought would happen. It's a thrill. He's a good young man. He'll be a fine legislator in his own right, and for a proud dad, it's just a real honor to be able to serve together. How
often do you interact with him during the day?
Well, the last couple of days we've both been very busy and hardly see each other, but traditionally quite a bit. I mean, he will come across the aisle, not politically, but he physically sits right across the aisle from me, and he'll say, "Dad, what do you think of this? What about that?" And so we'll go back and forth, and I've given him a lot of advice only at his request.
Does he take it?
Of course, he does. In fact, he asks for it. That's when I give it.
Okay. Thank you, General. Thank you, Representative Koppelman.
Thank you.
It's good to have you.
Our guest, Kim Koppelman, representative from West Fargo, who is the author of legislation to enhance the enforcement of DUI legislation, get tougher on DUI offenses in North Dakota. The biggest chunk of that is a mandatory jail offense for the jail time, rather, for the first offense. We thank you very much.
Thank you
for joining us today on the program. We're live and on location at the Peacock American Grill and Bar, downtown Bismarck. We'll continue with more of our conversation on this topic from the perspective of prosecutors and also law enforcement. Stay tuned. That'll continue on the Legislature Today radio show, live and direct from downtown Bismarck in the Peacock Alley American Grill and Bar. Don't go away. We're back. It's more of the Legislature Today radio show. Quick reminder, we're here Saturdays now between 10 a.m. and noon, and we are making an extra effort to connect with legislative forums that will be going on in your communities all throughout North Dakota throughout the legislative session. And if you listen Saturday between 10 and noon, you'll get a good idea of when the next forum is in your community, and also hear from the legislators and community members back home on the issues that the legislature is impacting. So stay tuned for that Saturdays 10 a.m. to noon on 550 K-Fire and Talk Radio AM 1100 The Flag Fargo, as well as Talk Radio 1090 The Flag in the Bakken. Dale Wetzel is the managing editor for the Great Plains Examiner and Great Plains News. In a moment, we'll introduce two new guests for this topic of the hour, and that is the discussion over a new legislation on DUI laws. And you mentioned earlier, Dale, that you had a conversation with parents that had lost two sons, which obviously is just beyond comprehension, and you're going to share some of their comments about this particular proposal from today, right? Yes.
What we're talking about here, Scott, is a 9-year-old boy and a 5-year-old boy were run over as they were sleeping in a tent on a Lake Metagoshi campground. The driver who ran them over in his pickup is charged with reckless endangerment and manslaughter, and the authorities up there said that he had been drinking. And the parents of the 9-year-old boy and the 5-year-old boy were in the Capitol this morning. They are interested in tougher DUI laws in North Dakota, and the parents' names are Juan Rees and Sandy Hernandez. And the clip that we're about to hear is Mr. Rees talking about what he and his sons did the last day his sons were alive.
We were doing our fishing. We got to ride jet skis. My boy's never been on jet skis before. Never been on a boat, never been on a pontoon, never been tubing before, so all of these were experiences for their first time, that they got to experience. And, our plan was to stay at a friend's house, but when we had other friends out there that had tents and at the campsite already, they had a little boy that is around the same age as my older son. So we all made the decision of just camping out with them. They wanted us to stay there My boys wanted to stay there, you know, so they like camping. They like sleeping in tents. As you can see, we got a picture where we go fishing and camp out at the lake. But this was just a whole new experience for them, different kind of scenery, you know, and you know, when nighttime came around, you know, just time to go to sleep, you know, we went in the tent. I let them play with the phone, play video games for a little bit, you know, with their PS portables, PlayStations. And when it was time to go to sleep, you know, said goodnight. We had more plans in the morning. And next thing I remember, you know, the accident is taking place.
The plans in the morning he's referring to, they were going to go fishing that morning. And it's a tough thing. Well, here we have with us to discuss a possible new DUI law. We have Mr. Aaron Bierst, who is a former prosecutor in Stutzman County and Cass County. He is the legal counsel for the North Dakota Association of Counties. And we have Mr. Mike Wrighton, who is the Assistant Chief of Police of West Fargo. He started his law enforcement career in 1984 in Castleton. And we'll talk about this a little later. This isn't related to DUI specifically, but one of the reasons that Mr. Wrighton is here is he's going to testify tomorrow on legislation that would raise the speeding fines and fines for traffic violations in North Dakota. They've been the same for some time. And as a matter of fact, Mr. Wrighton tells the story, and I think he's going to tell it tomorrow at the legislative hearing, that when he wrote his first ticket as a Castleton police officer, the fine for that ticket was the same as it is today, and this was in 1984. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Mr. Wrighton, can you just talk about what sort of practical challenges would be brought about if there is a mandatory jail sentence for DUI offenders?
Well, the sheriffs have been speaking about the jail capacity or jail population at this time, and that the population is running near capacity most days. If we do go to a type of sentencing where there is mandatory jail time, there is going to be some issues on space and where we're going to house these folks. We need to be looking at the bill, and some discussions have been made as far as other types of alternative housing, whether it's house arrest with electronic monitoring, whether it's a halfway house type setting. We're going to need to put out all of the possibilities on the table and work through this to figure out a solution.
Do you think that house arrest with electronic monitoring would prove to be the kind of deterrent that one might want?
We really think that putting somebody in a restrictive environment is going to get the message to them that if you go out and violate the DUI laws in North Dakota, we're going to restrict your freedoms. And if we end up having to do that through electronic monitoring, so be it. It's certainly not as restrictive as spending time in jail. It may not be as large an impact, but I think it will be an impact on these individuals to be, in essence, babysitted by the state because their behaviors were inappropriate.
What about a suggestion that I've heard is if you have a mandatory jail sentence for someone who is well above the .08, and I don't even know what the final number would be, but say, you know, someone who's .12 or .15, maybe a mandatory jail sentence would be appropriate for them, but maybe house arrest or maybe not even a jail sentence at all would be appropriate for someone who's just over the limit. Has there been any discussion of that?
Certainly we could model this law after what they do in Minnesota, where it's a graduated offense. I believe it's 10 factors that they look at over in Minnesota, one being the BAC level, whether they've had children in the vehicle, how many priors they had, and that type of setup where it's a calculation that you run them across the matrix, and here's the sentence that they get.
Mr. Bierst, I wanted to ask you a question from a prosecutor's standpoint. If if we have a law in North Dakota that says thou shalt spend 4 days in jail if you have a DUI, if you have a conviction for DUI, are you going to have more DUI trials? And what is that going to do to the justice system in North Dakota?
Yeah, Dale, thanks again, and Scott for having us on the show. I think it's pretty clear anytime you increase those minimum mandatories, there will have to be an effect, which you will be looking at more trials. You will be looking at increased jail costs. But I got to be honest, as I'm sitting here looking at this postcard with the 2 young boys that were lost, I mean, that's a significant policy decision, but it seems to pale in comparison to the loss that this father had. But clearly, anytime you increase those minimum mandatories, there will be an impact to the prosecutor ranks, to the law enforcement ranks, to the court system, and then ultimately the jail.
I'm curious, how many first-time offenses of DUIs were there, for instance, last year? Do we know that number?
Yeah, we have about 4,000. 6,500 people in North Dakota are arrested for DUI a year, and about a third of those are multi-offenders. So we're pegging the number at about 4,000 first-time DUI offenders.
To what extent do you think that number might be reduced if there is the prospect of a mandatory jail sentence, and that fact is well known?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. What would be the deterrent effect? Clearly, if you do more cases in jail, that's going to cost money. The counter is, at the end of the day, if more people get the message that they shouldn't get behind the wheel, that's what we want to convey. And ultimately, in the long term, there'll be some cost savings. We don't know that. We just don't know that. I mean, this isn't a unique problem to North Dakota. It's nationwide. I think North Dakota has had some very difficult cases and is increasing and trending in the wrong way that most of the states in the other part of the country are trending downward.
I was curious of the math. Let's get positive and say, the deterrent cuts it in half, right? So it goes to 2,000 first-time offenders, 2,000 times 4 days. I mean, are there even that many, places to have prisoners put their head on the pillow? Is it doable? Is it manageable? I mean, you don't know when they're going to happen, and I mean, there's a lot of variables there. But I mean, is the jail space available?
Under the current circumstances, if you were talking putting 4,000 people in prison for 4 days or in jail for 4 days, the jail space in many counties who run the jails would not be available. So there would have to be some sort of separate, or else you would have to move the system in a different direction and stop putting people in jail for other crimes. There would have to be a trade-off, at least initially. But that's why the legislature is debating this right now. But counties would bear the cost of that.
The folks who are in the county jails, what are they in there for generally?
Well, the county jail structure picks everybody up from DUI all the way to homicide. When the homicide cases and the rape cases are completed, then they usually go off to the penitentiary that the state obviously funds. So everybody is in those county jails, but large amounts of those are small misdemeanors that are serving specific time. Most of them are repeat offenders on other crimes where the judge continues to ratchet up the time in jail.
Mr. Wrighton, would a mandatory jail sentence for DUI offenders, would that affect how the police make DUI arrests, or for want of a better term, the thoroughness of it, or I don't know.
No, I don't see that having any type of effect. Ultimately, the sentence isn't going to make the difference. The officers are expected to prepare good casework and present it to the prosecutor, and then it's up to the prosecutor to prove the case. As far as the law enforcement side, we will probably see more time in the courts, so we will have some expense with overtime and the availability of officers that are tied up in court. However, again, as Aaron mentioned, there's going to be a bubble in the beginning of this, we expect, where people are going to challenge it a little bit. They're not going to believe that we're serious about it. And then comes the point where the word gets out and somebody's had to spend 4 days in jail or whatever that ultimate sentence is, and that it's more severe than the $250 fine that they currently get. So the whole idea here is long range. We can't look at what's going to happen tomorrow. We need to look at what this is going to look like 2-3 years down the road.
What I'd like both of you gentlemen to address this question. Why is it that the common wisdom here in this debate is that a first-time offender basically gets a $250 fine, even though the law allows that that person can be put in jail for as long as 30 days. Why do you think it is that first-time offenders right now, under the current law, are treated as they are?
You know, I would have to say it's just how the system is developed. It's the acceptance level. In theory, there's nothing stopping a prosecutor on a first-time DUI that's a B misdemeanor to come in and ask the judge to put the person in jail for 30 days, which would far exceed the minimum mandatory. But prosecutors haven't been asking for those kind of sentences. If there's a unique case, they do. And judges haven't been imposing it, and society doesn't expect it. So I think there's that society resistance to really doing much more than that first-time DUI. The night you're arrested, that's the only time you'll spend in jail.
Well, why do you think that's the norm, a $250 fine?
Well, I was approached by some individuals at the Capitol today and said, boy, we got to go easy on the first DUI because, you know, that could be me. And we need to get away from that mindset that where we have people thinking, well, that could be me. No, it shouldn't be you, because if you do drink, you choose not to drive, or you drink responsible. Individuals said that they like to stop and have a couple martinis after work and spend an hour talking with friends. Having a couple martinis, talking with friends for an hour, hour and a half in the bar, you're not going to end up in a situation where you're going to get a DUI. You sit at the bar for an hour and you pound 5 shots of whiskey and have a couple beer chasers, you're going to have a problem with that. But that's problem drinking.
Dale, if I could just jump in on that.
Certainly.
The average arrested DUI in North Dakota is a 1.7 to 1.8. On the fatalities, we run about 0.24 for the fatality numbers. And when you look at the crash in Jamestown, I think the BAC was a 2.4. That's pushing 2 to 3 times the limit on the average DUI. So I can't emphasize that enough. The concept that you have a 12-ounce beer after work and all of a sudden you're running the risk of a DUI, that is not the people we're seeing in the criminal justice system. We're seeing people who have serious problems getting behind the wheel after they've been consuming lots of alcohol.
So here's a question I have. Currently, the law says after a second offense, 5 days is a minimum mandatory sentence. Is there any statistics that say, okay, after that 5-day sentence, they're a lot less likely to offend, that would translate to if this is moved up to a first offense?
That's a great question, Scott. Actually, there is some studies on that. And in fact, I've seen some studies that are published by the alcohol industry that a lot of good alcohol industry folks are responsible that say these small jail time sentences don't change those behaviors for those people who choose to get behind the wheel after drinking all night long. So that is a legitimate thought. I don't have any statistics that'll show necessarily that the minimum mandatory will be an effective deterrent, other than most people understand when there is a minimum mandatory, it's ratcheted up the cost of doing what you're doing. So that's something you got to think about. But I can't tell you for sure that's necessarily effective.
Another thing I wanted to explore about this bill, when we talk about the bill, we're talking about the bill that's being introduced by the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Kim Koppelman. It's I believe it's HB 1302 for folks who want to track it. There is a penalty, essentially the penalty if you refuse a test once you're pulled over. The penalty that if you refuse a test is the same as if you're convicted, or you're essentially you have to pay the same price if you refuse a test that you would if you were judged to be driving under the influence. The question I have for you, Mr. Wrighton, is why do you think so many folks refuse the test now?
Well, the way that the sentencing is set up, some of it is based on a blood alcohol content level through testing, and by refusing to submit to that test, they can escape some of the sentencing guidelines that are involved with that.
Why do you think people refuse the test, Aaron?
Many states have much higher refusal rates than North Dakota. But the concept of providing somebody the right to refuse, which in North Dakota you have the right to do, was almost to try to get somebody at the time higher license suspension so they would consent to take the test. Most states have gone away from the right to refuse if you're arrested for a driver driving under the influence. Minnesota does the same thing that's in this proposal, which is criminalized refusal. Other states have gone to just complete elimination or refusal. South Dakota is the model where they say, if you get arrested for DUI, we're getting a test one way or the other. And coincidentally, there's a U.S. Supreme Court case on whether a warrant's required. But most states have trended away from that. The original intent was not to necessarily give DUI offenders an option to refuse it, but it turned into that. So a lot of the hardcore offenders is where we see the refusal, where they understand the system and they understand I'm not going to provide a test because that only potentially enhances the penalties for me. So that's where we've seen it. Maybe, Mike, you've seen some different.
Mr. Wright, and I'd also like to explore the idea of as I understand it, in South Dakota, the test is compulsory, and the specter that was raised by the introduction of this bill, and the explanation that was given for not having a compulsory test is that we do not want the police wrestling with people or fighting with people to give them a test when they're not willing to take one. Is that a possibility if the test is mandatory?
It's certainly a safety concern in some of the smaller populated areas. One or two officers working a night. Are you going to bring everybody in to hold somebody down to make sure that you get that blood test in?
Hang on one second. We just reconnected, so I want you to hold that thought, your answer to Dale's question.
Is that what you were signaling about?
No, we had a couple questions from the website.
Oh, okay.
When you're ready, so I don't want to jump in when you're not finished.
Okay.
All right, and we are back. Short disruption in our connection to the K-Fire studios from downtown Bismarck.
We were talking about the problems that would be posed by requiring the administration of a test in the field. If you have an officer who is confronting a suspect who doesn't want to take the test.
Right, and to physically force someone to take the test, it does take extra manpower. There's potential of either the person arrested or an officer being injured. We would just as soon stay away from the physical restraints to get our test. And if we can enact a portion of this bill that somebody refuses to take or to cooperate with the taking of the test, that they receive a similar type sentence. And
we have a couple of questions that have come in from GreatPlainsNews.com, and this is a theme you hear quite a bit, quite honestly, so I'm going to combine two comments here. Martha says, how terrible to lose any person in such a horrific accident, speaking of the situation with the Deutschers. That person should not have been drinking and driving. No person should. But we cannot legislate all accidents out of people's lives. They went on to say to show the vehicle at a decisive time is a little manipulating, don't you think? Lee made the comment, to make sober decisions not to drive, you need to be sober. When intoxicated, it's easy to make the decision to drive regardless of what the penalty is. Sad, but it must be true to consider that so many people drive while intoxicated without a thought of what the horrible outcome could be. Why? Because they are not in a shape to think, let alone drive. There's a lot of sentiment like that related to this proposal. Aaron, how would you respond to that?
The first thing I would say is I tend to call these crashes. They're not accidents. Somebody got behind the wheel, chose to drive when they should not. I'd also say it's a global problem. Yes, individual responsibility is important, but committing homicide is against the law, and we still enforce the law. We still have homicides. We don't just simply say it happens, there's nothing we can do. I think that's a wrong take on public policy. I think we do need to address this globally, and one bill's not going to do it. But you have alcohol servers that need to be trained. You have people who have to make the right call. You have to have friends that step in to try to help you, too. But you can't just walk away and say there's nothing we can do.
Chief Wright, another quick one is we've heard from some bar owners who say that the law right now requires them to basically take any patron that's at the bar at 12:59 and get them outside. And if one of those patrons calls a cab, sometimes that can take a long time in a busy city like West Fargo or Bismarck or whatever. And quite often, if they wait too long, they end up just getting behind the wheel rather than waiting for a cab. Anything that could be done in that regard? Is that a complaint you've heard before?
Yes, and what is the option? Maybe the bar shuts down serving an hour prior to closing time so that the individuals in the bar have an opportunity to make those arrangements to get home. Maybe the bar needs to be making the contact with the taxi half hour, 45 minutes before it closes and have a taxi on the way. There are some things that bars can do as businesses to change their business practices to help this problem. The individual that killed the Deutscher family in the bar, drinking beer, taking straight shots, gets behind the wheel. Somebody poured those drinks for him. Somebody put them on the bar in front of him, and there has to be some responsibility there too.
As I understand it, the crash happened in the early evening, so this is not a guy who was, pitched out on the street while he was waiting for a cab. He left well before closing time, and he was blitzed.
Now, Mike will tell you, you can pick up guys at 8 in the morning.
At 10 o'clock in the morning, I had my highest recorded BAC on an arrest, and it was a 3-2.
And this person was conscious?
Conscious and motivating. I knew he was impaired because of the way he was moving, but he was a 3-2 at 10 o'clock in the morning. A habitual drunkard. And there's been some discussion on getting the definition of a habitual drunkard. Devil's Lake is working with the habitual drunkards and coming in the bar. The problem with detoxing people. The one bill that I've seen on the DUI, they're talking about having your driver's license stamped if you have an alcohol problem and then refusing your service. Okay.
We've been talking to Aaron Bierst, who's the legal counsel for the North Dakota Association of Counties and a former prosecutor in Cass and Stutzman counties. And we also have been talking to Assistant West Fargo Police Chief Mike Wrighton. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming in tonight and discussing this DUI legislation that we have in the North Dakota Legislature.
Thank you, and I just want to thank the shows like this. Getting the message out does a lot more than even the law can do. So thank you for having us on and talking.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sure.
Fascinating conversation with these two gentlemen this half hour, and earlier Representative Kim Koppelman on the actual legislation itself. And this discussion really starts now in the North Dakota Legislature. Much more to come when the hearings for the bill comes, and of course a good opportunity for you to let your legislative leaders know what you think of this legislation as well. We need to take a break. Continue with more on the Legislature Today radio show, and thank you for listening.